Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Lynn Library and to tonight's event. I'm Julie Andrews, the director here at the library. So first of all, I have to give you a few housekeeping things. So a reminder that mobile phones should be turned off or put to silent for the duration of this evening. Our toilets are accessed by a card system and a card will be available at the back of the room. In the event of an evacuation, please follow the instructions of your nearest member of staff. Needless to say, we're not planning a fire drill this evening, so if the alarms go off, you have to follow one of us. So again, welcome to the Lynn Library. We're very delighted to see you all here tonight, and we want to celebrate the launch of our latest exhibition, Years of Chaos and Hope. I would like to begin by thanking everyone who helped bring this exhibition together. Firstly, this exhibition has been generously funded by the Reconciliation Fund from the Irish Government's Department of Foreign Affairs. But most importantly, I would like to thank Melissa Bird, who has curated this exhibition and put together the programme of events. She's been working in the library on this project for the past 5 months and has worked extremely diligently, and it's been a pleasure to have her here working on it. So after all the cheers from Melissa's friends and family, this exhibition could not have been completed without the efforts of our digital content marketing team, Scott Edgar and Annie Kanakaki. Our collections team have also been invaluable in their guidance on the plethora of materials we're fortunate enough to hold here. Our arts and cultural programmer, Jason Burke, has also given support and advice to Melissa in the planning of the exhibition and the events which will run alongside it. We would also like to thank the Fermanagh Museum and the Public Records Office for lending us artefacts from their archives also. This exhibition was designed to commemorate the turmoil through which the Lynn Hall, its visitors and its surroundings endured in 1922 and 1972, which is the focus of our keynote lecture tonight with the great Dr. Éamon Phoenix, as well as to illuminate the instances of hope which can be found amongst the chaos. Our exhibition is built almost solely upon our archives, particularly the Northern Ireland Political Collection, which is a vital record of the diversity of opinions and perspective that make up the society in which we live. Trying to recreate shared historical narratives is difficult in any setting, but in an area with such a contentious and contested past, and particularly in years as pivotal as 1922 and 1972, meant that the creation of this exhibition sometimes reflected its title, with a strong emphasis on the chaos side of things. As such, this exhibition gives an insight into 1922 and 1972 from the perspective of the Linen Hall's archive. It does not claim to represent a universal experience, for that simply doesn't exist. Instead, in this exhibition, we have tried with care and sensitivity to explore some of the key events which are documented in our archives. When we begin to trawl through our materials pertaining to 1922 and 1972, I think Melissa quickly realised that what they had in common was times of trouble, evidenced most clearly by the fact that both years suffered the highest number of casualties of the conflict in the 20s and in our more recent conflict. What we also found was that in both 1922 and 72, there were significant interventions made by the government, which had significant and lasting repercussions on the course of history in Northern Ireland. Therefore, as you will have seen from the exhibition, and if you haven't had a chance, please do have a look on your way out, we have set out to highlight some instances of the conflict, the responses by the UK and Northern Irish Government, and how these measures were received by different communities. Surprisingly, reactions to these interventions transcended traditional divides. Please see especially the section on the 4th floor on the Loyalist and Republican reactions to internment and political imprisonment. Finally, this brings us to the hope section of the exhibition. Our hope is that through exploring these times of chaos, we can recognise that through the conflicting perspectives, interpretations, justifications and aspirations, there are more moments of unity than we initially think. Equally, that our collective experiences that we did endure, and we are now committed to working through the chaos to more hopeful times. Most of all, we hope that the Lynn Hall Library remains a place of hope that is meant to readers, visitors and members for the past 50, 100 and 234 years. Melissa's here this evening, so please feel free to talk to her if you haven't already about the exhibition, and she will also be doing curator tours as part of the programme. So now, without further ado, you're not here to listen to me tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Éamon Phoenix for his keynote lecture, 1922 and 1972, Years of Turmoil, Loss and Hope Deferred. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to the previous speaker, the director of the library, for her kind remarks, and to Melissa as well for liaising with me and for inviting me to do this talk tonight. When I'm hoping to look at two critical years in modern Irish history, 1922, which, like many in the audience perhaps, I learnt about from folk memory and whispered remarks about dark deeds and definitely hope deferred, and 1972, which I remember. And remember it well enough to know what a horrific year it was, with the highest number of fatalities of the recent troubles in that particular year. There are similarities between the two years in terms of the intensity of the violence, the involvement of paramilitary organizations, the extent of expulsion from homes. I mean, remember that that period, 1969 to 72, saw the biggest population movement in Western Europe since the Second World War. Something like 60 to 80,000 people were forced out of their homes across this city. And that's an amazing kind of statistic. And indeed, some of the people moved were in their new incarnations, and in the impacts of the troubles on them were to become major figures and sometimes transformative figures for good or evil in the history of this place from the 1970s on. So we're going to sort of look at some of that now, and I suppose going back to 1922, we haven't time to go into all the background of how we got to where we were then, but suffice to say the Partition Act, the Government of Ireland Act 1920, had been passed at Westminster in December 1920. The proposals had been for a 9-county excluded area called Northern Ireland with its own parliament, and a 23-county Southern Ireland governed from Dublin, both limited home rule parliaments with the Council of Ireland as a bond of union between them. But of course, the Ulster Unionists, led by James Craig, rejected 6 counties. He said Protestant representation would be strengthened, his words, in a 6-county entity. And so the plans were redrafted, and in the end, partition provided for the 6 legislative counties and the urban areas of Belfast, of Newry and Londonderry were included in the mix. So that was the background, but of course that coincided with the escalation of the War of Independence, which affected the whole island. From the day the first Dáil was proclaimed, based on the Sinn Féin landslide of 1918, the first Dáil, headed by a president, Éamon Phoenix, actually the word was Príomh-Eala, First Minister, Michael Collins as Minister of Finance and others, it began to run a counter-state in nationalist Ireland, impacting on border areas of the proposed Northern Ireland. And of course, partition wasn't finally confirmed to 1925. So, just a quick recap on events, of course. Partition was really confirmed at the treaty negotiations of 1921. The aims of the negotiators, led by Arthur Griffith, the father of Sinn Féin, the architect of dual monarchy, the idea of 2 separate states, Britain and Ireland, but sharing a common king. That's what the original Sinn Féin under Griffith proposed. And Michael Collins, who had come up through the ranks of the Gaelic League, the IRB, the Irish Volunteers, 10 years in London, and then blooded in the Easter Rising, and a devotee of guerrilla warfare and an intelligence war, which dominate the 1919 to 21 period. And so, you know, they eventually reach a truce with the British in the summer of 1921. It's sealed by the King's speech in this city. You know, the King calls upon Irishmen to forgive and forget. A big ask, really. But that paves the way for negotiations, finally opened in October 1921 in London. The big issues were national status. What would the status of the new Irish state be? Would it be the Republic of the 1916 proclamation, or would it be something less? Dominion status like Canada or South Africa. That is what the British were insisting on, because a republic in Ireland would derogate from the integrity of the British Empire, and maintaining that empire was the kind of axiomatic aim of the British government. The second aim, though, of the negotiators was to achieve Irish unity if possible, the partition issue. But it always played second fiddle to the question of national status, the status of the future Irish state. And in the end, the best that Collins and Griffith could get was a kind of a nebulous boundary commission, which lacked a plebiscite, which lacked those teeth, which had given power to plebiscites in Schleswig-Holstein between Germany and Denmark, or in Silesia, more importantly, where huge territories moved by 51% votes, a la Brexit. But there was no plebiscite, and this was going to be debated over, lost in the midst of the Irish Civil War. And when the commission was finally established, it would leave the border exactly where it was 4 years earlier. Nonetheless, the treaty was brought back. The Dáil cabinet split. De Valera was almost going to have the delegates arrested when he was dissuaded from doing that. And so this fractured cabinet, which had voted 4-3 in favour of the treaty, with President De Valera at odds with his senior ministers, Collins and Griffith, was brought to Dáil Éireann to be debated over a 3-week period straddling the Christmas of 1921, a period when great forces became involved. The press, overwhelmingly pro-treaty. In Belfast, the Irish News, overwhelmingly pro-treaty. The Irish News said it should have been passed by 107 votes, and not the mere 7 which had pushed the treaty over the line. And then you had the power of the Catholic Church. In the pulpits that Christmastide, bishops and priests echoed Cardinal Logue's famous words, "This peace is God's gift." And this swung a lot of delegates who were siding with De Valera because of, you know, his prestige, the senior surviving commandant of the Rising. One man, though, warned that the treaty would result in partition perpetuated. He was the son of a Belfast publican in King Street, John Francis, better known as Sean McEntee, who had qualified as an electrical engineer at Belfast Tech, from a wealthy Catholic family with a string of pubs in the town. He fought in the Rising, was sentenced to death, was spared, and now was a Sinn Féin TD for County Monaghan, but had been heavily involved in the IRA in Belfast down to 1920. And McEntee's speech was the speech that said that really the Boundary Commission would fail and partition would be perpetuated by the treaty which Collins had signed. It wasn't a popular view. Collins argued, yes, this is a stepping stone to real freedom. He was an IRB man, an instinctive Republican, but also in the pragmatic tradition of that secret society from the 1850s on. So Collins said that it's not the freedom that all nations aspire and develop towards, but it's the freedom to achieve freedom. That became a ringing phrase in, you know, editorials up and down the country, and swung most Northern nationalists into the Collins camp. For De Valera, it was about symbolic issues. The oath of allegiance to a foreign king, you know, membership of the British Commonwealth, until recently the British Empire. MacDonagh's bony thumb was raised, in the words of the poet Yeats, in Dáil Éireann, meeting in Ellsford Terrace, the old university college buildings. At this stage, people were saying Patrick Pearse wouldn't have voted for this. James Connolly wouldn't have voted for this. This being backed by the wives and relatives of the martyred dead. So it was a very bitter dialectic in Dáil Éireann during this period. But in the end, the treaty was passed by 7 votes. De Valera was forced to resign, and Michael Collins became effectively Prime Minister, chairman of the provisional government of the Irish Free State. Legally, of course, the whole of Ireland had been included in the Irish Free State. You know, Ballymena was in the Irish Free State for 1 year, legally, because the North had to opt out of the Irish Free State. But in the meantime, the power of Dáil Éireann ministries was stayed in relation to the 6 counties. So there were some Sinn Féin TDs who hoped, against hope, that Craig might decide with certain safeguards to remain in the Irish Free State. He'd already been promised in the treaty the retention of his government, his parliament and his police force, which included 32,000 members of the Ulster Special Constabulary. Much more than De Valera, Collins had carried a torch for the Northern nationalists. Like De Valera, he'd been returned for a Northern seat in 1921 in the first partition elections, returned for Armagh, you know, almost topping the poll. And on the eve of the negotiations had actually visited his constituency, addressing 20,000 people with a march past of the local IRA in the cathedral grounds in Armagh. Pictured here with Owen O'Duffy, a senior Ulster IRA man, and Éamon Donnelly, an Uri Sinn Féin organiser. And Collins told them they would not be forgotten in the negotiations in London. And he continued to argue that, you know, he would defend the rights of Northern nationalists regardless of the treaty. But of course, we were immediately into a battle for hearts and minds. Now, of course, Collins and De Valera took to the hustings, but an election which should have been held by February 1922 to determine the issue once and for all was deferred because people in Sinn Féin argued that because of the Northern crisis, 450 people would die violently in Belfast from July 1920 to July 1922. That violence was continuing, even intensifying in 1922. One of the most violent years. I mean, the one thing strikes me about these troubles is when I, having lived through, as a student and so on, the troubles of, you know, 40 years ago, whatever, was the targeting deliberately of women and children by gunmen. 2 women being shot dead in the kitchen of the house was a regular occasion in East or North Belfast, you know. Or the bombing of the little girls at Weaver Street swinging on lampposts on a moonlit night in February 1922. Churchill said the violence was cannibalism, except the perpetrators, a word we still hear, stopped short of actually devouring the flesh of the victims. So Collins is arguing if we don't stay united in the South, then partition will be confirmed, the Northern nationalists will suffer. But the cabinet meeting at Cabin Hill near Stallman Castle, which was now being used at that time even as a cabinet meeting place, of course the gleaming Parliament buildings were a decade away, Craig was very angry at the treaty. For him, the Boundary Commission was a perfidious breach of faith by Lloyd George and his coalition cabinet. Remember, we talk about a coalition, but the British government in these years is dominated by the Tories. They could have dropped Lloyd George at any time, but they kept him to deal with peace in Europe. He's on a tightrope between the devil and the deep blue sea, a prime minister whose party had evaporated during the First World War. And Lord Beaverbrook's famous phrase, Lloyd George was the prime minister of the party. So Craig and his cabinet, with hardliners like Dawson Bates in charge of policing, justice and the electoral system, moderates like Londonderry and Edward Archdale, the guy with the bowler hat, Craig in the middle. It's a coalition of the various, I suppose, sectoral and geographical interests of unionism who had been involved in this project to discover a homeland out of Home Rule in that frenzied decade, 1912 to 1921. And of course, a key figure in all of this is Winston Churchill, snapped here at his famous and indeed quite traumatic visit to Belfast back in February 1912, when as First Lord, Churchill had come in the footsteps of his erratically unionist father, Lord Randolph, to address a Home Rule meeting in Celtic Park. Well, he was forced to go there because he was denied the use of the Ulster Hall. And with his beautiful wife on the platform, he said that Ulster must seek the reconciliation of races, North and South. Then Ulster would fight and Ulster would be right. But of course, he was attacked by a mob at Larne Station. He and his wife were attacked with dead fish. She had a miscarriage the following week. Churchill rethought his views on the Irish question. And by 1921, he was very much sympathetic to Craig and the Unionists. But he did want to achieve stability and peace on the island on the basis of the treaty. So this is a very, very conflicted period with so many actors. And some of the more moderate voices, like that of Joe Devlin, the Northern Nationalist leader, returned as an MP for Falls in 1918, had been sidelined by Nationalist Ireland as yesterday's man. And his party was now in tatters, replaced by Sinn Féin. And it was Churchill who, during these early months of 1922, brought together the 2 Irish Prime Ministers, so we can call them that, Craig and Collins. Think about that first meeting in the Colonial Office in London on the 21st of January, 1922. These 2 men who were polar opposites from different ends of the island. Craig, the architect of partition, and the 6-county entity. He had rejected 9 counties, including the unionists of Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal, in the interest of producing a more permanent entity. But of course, his critics would have said that had he gone for 4 counties to 3.5 counties, which had been one of the possibilities before 1920, he would have had a much more a Rock of Gibraltar type unionism going forward in perpetuity. And then, of course, here we have Craig entering the City Hall in Dublin, in Dame Street there beside Dublin Castle, in February 1922 for a follow-up meeting. Collins, of course, was the architect of the IRA and the IRA campaign, a man who had run the 3 or 4 IRA divisions in the north and would continue to arm them and to orchestrate violent reactions right through the first half of 1922. Yet, in the Colonial Office that day, they reached an agreement against the odds. It was a very broad one. First of all, Craig had his concerns. The Boundary Commission was one of them. It was threatening the integrity of his Northern Ireland. Could they not get rid of the chairman, this English chairman, and sort it out among themselves? Collins appeared to be delighted. Yes, we'll get rid of the Englishman. You and I will sit down. Of course, Northern nationalists in border areas saw the danger that we would have talks about talks about talks. You remember those? And they would go on a very long time without anything issuing from them. On the other hand, Collins had his demand. He wanted the reinstatement of the 8,000 or 9,000 Catholic workers driven out of their jobs in the shipyards, the engineering work, on the Lagan and the Bann in the summer of 1920. That was going to be difficult. There was now a world recession and the shipyard was on half-time. Mills were in half-time. Ships were not being built. There was an overcapacity of world shipping, but he agreed to do his best. They were going to meet again to discuss it, and that was in Dublin on the 2nd of February 1922. And it was then the talks broke down dramatically when Collins showed Craig a map, coloured in green, suggesting that he was expecting over half the area of Northern Ireland under the Boundary Commission. Fermanagh and Tyrone at nationalist areas, Derry, Londonderry, Uri, South Down, South Armagh, and he was really saying to Craig, you try to run what's left. The talks broke down, and Craig was very suspicious of the British government, whose secret kind of conversations Collins seemed to be leaking in these negotiations. Almost immediately, the breakdown of that pact came as a match to a powder keg. An incident occurred at Clones railway station. The old Great Northern Line connected the whole 9 counties of Ulster with Belfast, Portadown, Cavan. That was a very important line. All the big Belfast firms did business right across the whole of Ireland, but the trains brought bread, goods, machine parts, you name it, to Cavan, Monaghan, Donegal. And that night, a party of B specials who were leaving Newtonard's police station came by train, heading for Enniskillen, but they went through Monaghan. The IRA were alerted. The train was stopped at Clones station. A gun battle broke out. The IRA commander, 5 specials were shot dead. A number of specials were captured and held secretly in southern military bases. This became part of the narrative. Collins' secret war in early 1922. Now, of course, this was to spark a sectarian conflagration in Belfast. On the following night, little girls at Weaver Street, a Catholic enclave now under the M2 in North Belfast, were playing. The inquest said a couple of B specials moved them to the end of the street. Whatever happened, bombs were thrown among them. 5 were killed, 6 or 7 terribly mutilated. It was a shocking atrocity. But it belongs to that period where shocking atrocities occurred, like the McMahon murders of a Catholic family, almost certainly involving the police, or the bombing of the Protestant Donnelly family in Millfield by Republicans, or the Altnevay killings in South Armagh of a little of the 6 inhabitants of a Protestant hamlet that June by the IRA. These are shocking times, no doubt about it. We have this amazing picture, as we have so many, from the top of the Belfast Telegraph building, of the kind of how riots started in Belfast from 1920 to 22. This is the old Metropole Hotel, which is at the corner of Donegal Street as you turn round towards the Cove, blitzed during the Second World War. And this is presumably the Protestant crowd from North Street and the Shankill. The Catholic crowd have come up from Sailortown. And that will eventually result in guns coming out, the bombing of trams, sectarian murders, because that's the pattern of that period. And some 200 of those 450 died in the first 6 months of 1922. Some weeks, 50, 60, some days, 30, 40 people are killed in Belfast in the same sectarian interfaces. Now, Collins, of course, has a twin-track policy towards the north in this period. On the one hand, he's seeking a united Ireland by stages through negotiations with Craig. On the other hand, of course, when his diplomacy fails, he reverts to, his IRA role, and he's very much consulting, arming, advising the IRA's Northern Division, particularly the IRA 3rd Northern Division, based in Belfast, much of County Down, and the whole of County Antrim. Their role, initially, a small operation, the old active service units from 1916, the volunteers of that day had been to defend Catholic areas. But they were given a remit by Collins during the War of Independence. One of the actions he called for, which happily was averted, was the burning of Belfast city centre in retaliation for the auxiliaries' burning of Cork City in 1920. Had that gone ahead, a much wider sectarian civil war might have been expected, and we can talk about why that was averted shortly. These are the men involved in the IRA. Tall man standing up is Joe McKelvey, son of a policeman. Many of the IRA men north and south were the son of RIC men, the old All-Ireland police force. He was a clerk in Mackey's. Seamus Woods on the far left from Ballyhorn in County Down was training to be an accountant. Perfect cover, offices in the city centre. This man here, Tom McNally, was working in the Great Northern Railway Station in charge of timetables, a key role, observing the movements of police and troops. And Frank Crummy, a schoolmaster in the Falls Road, was the intelligence officer. Most of these guys were white-collar workers. As Tom Garvin, the historian, wrote many years ago, talking about the War of Independence, subsistence farming and poverty produced few guerrillas. Most of the leadership were from a middle-class background in this period. And they were taking their orders from Collins during this period. And of course, they would carry out political assassinations, such as the assassination of William Twiddell, a Unionist MP, in May 1920, as well as other attacks and so on. This is an amazing story. I know I can't tell too many in an hour, but I'm dealing with 2 years. But I got a phone call in January, as I sometimes do, because I have a column in the Irish News, from somebody who said, listen, a guy has just been laying carpet for me, and he says that his Sacred Heart picture, a Catholic icon, fell in the house the other day. Bit of a chill when a picture falls. And but this was a lucky strike. Guess what fell out of the back? A letter in James Craig's handwriting praising the B specials from 1922. Let me see it, says I. The guys went to Sotheby's, I haven't seen him since. But this is his letter, James Craig, praising the B specials. And that reminds us that from Craig's point of view, the Unionists had never trusted the RIC. And they didn't have any real control over the British Army, which was still being controlled from Dublin Castle, even though the British were slowly evacuating. But Craig had in 1920 secured the right to, if you like, transform the Ulster Division of the Great War into the Ulster Special Constabulary with a large B section of manual workers and small farmers and farm labourers, 32,000 strong. So it was an amazing large force. So Craig is using that as his cutting edge to secure his 6 counties. But of course, the specials are much hated by the Catholic population. To quote Churchill's agent in Northern Ireland in these years, Stephen Tallons, they're regarded by the nationalist population with a hatred exceeding that which the Black and Tans inspired in the South. And the specials really had free rein. They are also responsible for many murders and atrocities during this period. But of course, following on from the treaty split, the IRA splits dramatically in March 1922. The vast bulk of IRA members in the South take the anti-treaty side, whereas the senior figures are linked to Michael Collins through the secret network of the IRB, and they pragmatically support the treaty. So now you have regular IRA, which become Collins's national army, supporting the Free State, and then you have the irregulars. There's a race for barracks. Shots are being fired. Gunmen are on the streets. They take over the forecourts in central Dublin, really a threat to the provisional government on the other side of the river. And of course, every organisation splits. Common, Amon, Sinn Féin. Friendships are fractured for the rest of most people's lives. A mixed marriage in County Cork in the 1960s means you've married one of the other side from the Civil War. But of course, in Belfast, things are really ugly by this stage. It's what the press describe as a carnival of terrorism. Just look at one event on the 23rd of March 1922. It was a dry spring day. 2 special constables were shot dead. This is just behind the City Hall at the junction of Joy Street. Joy Street running out to May Street there. 2 specials were shot dead there. Some of these buildings, I think, are still there. And in the previous 2 years of the Anglo-Irish War, the shooting of police or military always resulted in fairly prompt reprisals by unknown uniformed men in military lorries, the police or the military. There was a reprisal outfit because, do remember, in 1919, Lloyd George and the cabinet justified the use of reprisals against Republican paramilitaries. And that night, a lorry load of police and specials went up the Old Park Road, came across the Bruce Domain, which led to Kinnaird Terrace, because to go up the Antrim Road would be going into a different police area. And they murdered Owen McMahon, a very wealthy Catholic publican, a director of Glentown Football Club, a non-political Catholic, friend of Joe Devlin, the nationalist leader, and 4 of his sons and a bar manager who lived. The little boy actually went under a table in the shooting. And then men folk were lined up against the wall. The women were locked in another room. A man in a gruff voice said, "If your prayers to say them now." That seemed to be a signal. One witness said she could identify the leader of the gang, the man in the trench coat. She gave a graphic description of his round face and his dark eyes, pointed very much towards District Inspector John Nixon, who was later dismissed by the Unionists for sectarian behaviour in the police. But the policeman who investigated the following day was very careful to say she just repeated what the rest had said. She didn't. She gave a graphic description. He seemed to be trying to protect her. So the McMahon murders, of course, led directly to the second Craig Collins Pact. This is a Republican leaflet attacking the idea of Collins negotiating with Craig. This was a much larger agreement signed on the 30th of March 1922 in London by Craig and members of his cabinet, Collins and members of his. It began with the Churchillian phrase, because Churchill again was the arbitrator. Peace is today declared. Easier said than done in this country. And it went on to encapsulate proposals for the reform of the specials, a special Catholic committee chaired by Bishop McCrory to recruit suitable Catholics for the police and get away from this 99% Protestant police force, 32,000 strong. A conciliation committee would be set up. There was provision for talks at the end of the year between North and South to see if there was any possibility of a united Ireland before the North opted out. Craig, under immense pressure from the British government, agreed to this. Collins had produced this draft at the talks in London, but I know, the draft was produced by a small group of Catholic businessmen. Hugh Dougal, who was a carrier and an undertaker, Raymond Burke, who was a shipbroker, upper middle class Catholics, who wanted to deal with the immediate problems. But it really didn't deal with other things. There had been a demand for extra seats in the Northern Ireland Senate for nationalists, guarantees that PR would continue, guarantees of funding for Catholic schools. None of that was touched on. It was very much ad hocery. Nonetheless, it provided some hope. Westminster, that night, rejoiced in peace in Ireland. But, of course, we can see that a few days later, response came when, again, a lorry load of armed police, according to eyewitnesses, as recorded by the local parish priest, entered a little street off Clifton Street called Arnon Street, and 6 people were shot dead, including a baby. Collins demanded an inquiry. Craig said no, it would rake up old embers. The pact broke down. It was washed away in a river of blood. Homes were burnt out in North Belfast. Craig said the nationalists were burning their own homes. The local parish priest said no. He could see the flames of the houses being lit by loyalist mobs. So you have these two narratives. Unionists feeling under threat by the IRA, under siege by the IRA, nationalists seeing this as a pogrom against the 25% Catholic population in Belfast. And of course, Collins at this stage authorises an all-out northern campaign with Owen O'Duffy, leading Monaghan guerrilla leader involved. It goes off at half-cock. The order seems to come to cancel it at the last minute. But that doesn't stop the near capture of Belfast police headquarters, the burning of Shane's Castle, the disruption of the railway network, and eventually the Unionists respond with internment. A converted American cargo vessel is eventually anchored in Larne Loch, and 700 mainly political activists from the Republican side, no loyalists, although they had been very active, are interned. They include a lot of doctors, lawyers, vets, teachers, and of course chairman of Sinn Féin councils from Newry to Derry and that kind of thing. Cara Healy, the most famous internee, the Fermanagh Sinn Féin leader, a journalist, and indeed a long-lasting Stallman MP down to the 1960s. Of course, as the Civil War gets closer in the south, the IRA began to mass against the border. Trouble breaks out in Balleek and Pettigo, a divided village. Balleek's on the Donegal border. The IRA occupy the northern parts of these two villages. Churchill sends in the artillery, which Collins wasn't expecting. A woman gets into history here. This is the Honourable Hazel Laverton, who was the Lady of the Lake. She allowed her boat to be used to ferry B specials over in the Battle of Pettigo. And eventually the British Army occupy Pettigo for another year, even though it's in County Donegal. The event that changes everything is the assassination of this man. He was actually the landlord of David Trimble's grandparents in North County Longford. Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson and his brother D.M. Wilson, the Trimbles, were tenants on the Wilson estate. It was the Wilsons who undoubtedly gave his grandfather a recommendation to join the RIC as a small farmer's son. Wilson, a former chief of the Imperial General Staff, a strong supporter of the Union, a Southern Unionist, had been appointed military advisor by Craig. In Collins's eyes, he was the evil genius of anti-Catholic violence in the north. Collins almost certainly gave the secret order for his assassination in London on the 22nd of June. And that was the trigger that sparked the Civil War on the 28th of June, which would eventually take the lives of many on both sides, including Collins. But with the transfer of the Northern IRA to the south, people like Charlie Hawke, his father from South Derry, for example, or Dan McKenna from Maghera, who became Chief of Staff of the Irish Army during the Second World War. They were all Northern IRA men who took the pro-treaty side. And the result was, of course, as the violence extended in the south, then a peace came dropping slow on Belfast and Northern Ireland. But of course, nationalism was divided, defeated, excluded in this situation. And the rest is kind of history. So, moving on to 1972. Don't look at these files much, but I have to have them out anyway. What I'm going to do here, folks, is I'm going to look at some cabinet papers in 1972. I'll give you a sort of sense of 1972, the year. And of course, 72 is the year a lot of people in the audience will remember. The worst year of the Troubles. In fact, it could have been an awful lot worse. Accompanying the plans for Operation Motorman, the biggest British military operation since Suez in 1972, Edward Heath drew up plans for a dramatic repartition of Ireland. There's a ragged line down the line of the River Bann from Coleraine through Lough Neagh to Newry. And populations would be forced to move, Fermanagh farmers to West Belfast, the population of the Falls to Fermanagh. They have estimates of how many people would go. We're talking about ethnic cleansing, big time, in the summer of 1972. Heath expected up to 200 fatalities in Operation Motorman. Bloody Sunday had minded him away from that kind of action, but Bloody Friday had made it inevitable from a British point of view. The worst year of the Troubles, 750 died. They included 103 British soldiers, 41 RUC or UDR. The UDR founded in 1970 to replace the B Specials. 323 civilians, of whom 121 were assassination victims, either Protestant or Catholic. The IRA, obviously, the major player, as well as the British Army and the security forces, but also, of course, the UDA, which boasted 40,000 members by the summer of 1972. And the year began, of course, with the Edward Heath, the Conservative government, Prime Minister, if you like, trying to, if you like, do something which would at least reduce the impact of internment. Brian Faulkner in 1971 had sought the British government's permission to introduce internment to deal with the IRA, but Heath had given Faulkner a warning. Faulkner was very careful, only to bring the Deputy Prime Minister, Senator J.M. Andrews, with him, not anybody who might be a rival in his cabinet to London. And Heath had said, when General Tuzo, the British GOC in Northern Ireland, said internment he didn't think would make things any worse, but it mightn't make them any better. And Heath said, okay, you can have internment, but if it's seen to alienate the nationalist population by Christmas, you can expect direct rule. So Faulkner knew he was taking a calculated risk, which he was never going to share with his colleagues. He was seen as a strong man of unionism who'd used internment when it was applied on both sides of the border successfully in the late 1950s. But by September, although Heath was fending off Jack Lynch and telling him he had no right to interfere in the internal affairs of the UK, he was nonetheless telling Faulkner very sharply, and Heath could be terrifying. I remember Heath could be terrifying. I remember Roy Bradford telling me that Faulkner was very much terrified by Heath. Lots of people were. When he got them on their own, he really had a Lloyd Georgian effect, with probably more aggression. And Heath kept saying to Faulkner, you need to broaden your cabinet. You need to bring in the SDLP, a nationalist who had been boycotting Stallman since July 1971 because of a disputed shooting incident at the time. And Faulkner kept saying, no, I'm offering them committee chairmanships and so on. He wasn't prepared to do anything too major. And of course, Faulkner was under immense pressure behind the scenes during this time. Remorseless pressure to broaden his cabinet and so on. At the same time, unionism is fragmenting. We have the rise of the Vanguard Movement associated with Bill Craig, which is drawing in many unionists. It's a sort of a more militant ginger group within unionism at the time. And Craig is talking about, former Home Affairs ministers, about the need to shoot to kill, and he's prepared to raise an army to do this at the time, and so on. Another place where sparks are firing in late 71, early 72 is the Joint Security Committee, meeting at Stallman Castle. It had been set up really from 1969, when the British Army became involved on the streets after the troubles of that August. And it involved the GOC, military officers, the RUC, Chief Constable, and of course, people like Brian Faulkner and John Taylor, the Undersecretary at Home Affairs. And it's clear from the autumn of 1971 that the Unionists are pressing very hard for the takeover of the no-go areas in the Cregan, the Bogside, and indeed parts of West Belfast, where the IRA ran exclusively, and roadblocks were being held and bombing missions planned and so on. But General Tuzo was a very politically nuanced GOC, and he said no, he's working through middle-class Catholics in Derry to de-escalate the situation, and he wants to give this alternative strategy a chance. Nonetheless, there are voices in the British Ministry of Defence, including a man called A.W. Stevens, who in a famous memo discovered by the Savile Inquiry says, I believe that our policy in these areas, he's writing in September 71, is to turn off the electricity and water and, quote, let these areas rot from within. Now this is part of the United Kingdom they're talking about, the Bogside and Cregan in 1971. So there's huge tensions in this committee as we move into 1972. And of course the IRA bombing campaign is going on unremittingly. But of course the anti-internment marches are continuing in towns like Newry. Several are planned for Derry, and of course that Christmas 71 internment, of course, had actually inspired Christmas cards, you know. The entire nationalist population is being alienated from the state. There's a brilliant memo by a civil servant in the new found Ministry of Community Relations, headed by the moderate lawyer Basil MacIver at this time. And the civil servant, middle ranking, asks, "I've just got one question, Minister. Are we at war with the minority?" And this leads to a whole investigation, minority alienation, which will reach its apogee in the days after Bloody Sunday, when Catholic QCs are threatening to decline crown briefs in the courts of law. And there was always that element of Catholic consent to make Northern Ireland work. There was a prelude to Bloody Sunday, I suppose, on the Strand of McGilligan in January, when paras were used to confront John Hume and an anti-internment march. And there was considerable violence on the beach. It was what Hume said that day that rings down the years, and it's captured in Robert Key's Ireland documentary. The commanding officer said, "You can't march here. It's a prohibited area." And Hume said, "Well, we want to march in there." He said, "You're not. It's banned by your government." And Hume says, "It's not our government. And that's why you're here, because it's not our government." That's stark alienation of a population. I'm going the wrong, yes. And of course, this will result eventually in the events of Bloody Sunday in 1972. One document I would draw your attention to, I suppose, on Bloody Sunday, and there's so many documents on Bloody Sunday, is this one. This is the actual document from the Commander Land Forces, Major General Robert Ford, who was much more gung-ho in his approach than the more astute and nuanced Tuzub. And on the 7th of January, he wrote to the GOC at Cluna House, "I visited Londonderry on Friday the 5th of January with the ACC and held discussions with commander of the brigade, commanding officers and the police divisional commander. And he also talked to unionist traders in the city, and they told him that the arc of destruction was extending, and soon there would be none of Derry's business hinterland left because of the highly organised and, if you like, frenetic IRA bombing campaign." He described the situation in Londonderry as one of armed gunmen dominating the Cregan and Bogside, backed and protected by the vast majority of the population in these two areas, and of bombers and gunmen making occasional sorties out of those hardcore areas to cause incidents, mainly in the shopping areas of the Strand, William Street and so on. And he talks about this. And then he goes on to say, "The weapons at our disposal, CS gas and baton rounds, are ineffective. I am coming to the conclusion that the minimum force necessary to achieve a restoration of law and order is to shoot selected ringleaders amongst the Derry young hooligans after clear warnings have been issued." And he makes this. Now, this is part of the build-up to Bloody Sunday. At the JCC meeting at Stallman a few days earlier, the remarks are not attributed, but they say Sunday's march in Derry on the 31st of January, everybody calls it Derry, by the way, are likely to result in a shooting war. You see the tensions rising. And then it happens. Bloody Sunday happens. And we then get to a point that, of course, Brian Faulkner takes a call that afternoon. I remember his late wife telling me this for a BBC documentary. She said he took the phone at about 4:30 in his home in County Down. And he looked blanche as he put the phone down, and he turned round to me and he said, "There's been violence in Derry." That's the end of Stormont. He knew all the warnings he'd been getting from Heath in the days before that and so on. But we can see that from that moment on, although they were probably moving in that direction, the Heath government were determined now to remove the 50-year-old experiment in devolved government in Northern Ireland. At a cabinet meeting on the 2nd of March 1972 in Downing Street, the Home Secretary Reginald Modling, whose career was shortly about to end over a scandal, he said he believed the point had been reached when a decisive political initiative by the UK government was required. The RC minority had become totally alienated, and it was clear that despite military successes, military action alone could not bring peace and stability. In Modling's view, yes, the Protestant majority needed renewed assurances that the region would remain part of the UK. But, he said, political reform must be directed towards satisfying the aspirations of the nationalist population as well. And he believed the UK government would have to exercise direct responsibility for the administration of Northern Ireland for an interim period. And then he said this, which was very much at odds with the views of Andrew Bonar-Law and Lord Birkenhead, the Tories who had been allies of the Ulster Unionists 50 years before when the entity of Northern Ireland was set up. And this is what he said. He told his colleagues that the dangers involved in launching a political initiative were undoubtedly great, but he believed the dangers of not taking action now would be even greater. Quote, over 50 years, under an artificially constructed constitution, the Unionist Party had enjoyed political domination at Stormont to the exclusion of the minority community. As an inevitable result of this, the estrangement of the two communities was greater than ever. So they are assuming that Brian Faulkner will reject a scheme which leaves him the emperor with no clothes, no control of security, which was absolutely right. And it's then that Faulkner is summoned to London. He gets a lot of schmooze from, Heath, who's telling him, that, they're very impressed by the stoicism and the determination of the Unionist people of Northern Ireland. But he moves very quickly. It was necessary to consider how the Roman Catholics could be brought back into community life. It was not sufficient to go on dealing with violence. He realised that the Stallman government had put forward proposals for enlarging the House of Commons, but the UK government had decided these were not sufficient to give the permanent, active, guaranteed role for the minority. There's a bit of toing and froing between Brian Faulkner, who refuses to bring other cabinet ministers with him. No, he says he'd keep them in Belfast as a reserve. And in the end, he's explaining things the following day to his cabinet when the secretary comes in and said, Mr. Faulkner, Mr. Heath's on the radio suspending Stormont. That's how it comes about. So that's the last meeting. And there's a very, very tetchy relationship between Faulkner and the new Secretary of State, one of the Tory grandees, William Whitelaw. It's captured in the photographs. I don't think I have a photograph of them, but it's captured in the photographs. And of course, in the meantime, of course, you had the horrific atrocity, the bombing of the Abercromb. I remember that because I remember Graham Leach, a BBC reporter, breaking down and sobbing on the TV news that March evening. A slight hitch summed up in Porrig Fake's poem on the occasion. Things moved quite rapidly. Stormont is suspended. There's a huge demonstration at Stormont by members of the Unionist community, horrified that they've been stabbed in the back. But the British government, of course, at this stage are considering all options. And one of them is the possibility of an IRA ceasefire. And we move very quickly, and finally, I just want to say something about this. There was a blacklist, by the way. Local civil servants are concerned. People like, Ken Bloomfield, that they're going to be a kind of a second 11, because documents start coming into Stormont with UK eyes only on them, excluding local civil servants. There's also a sudden promotion of Catholics for the first time ever, because the first permanent secretary from the 1920s was Patrick Shea, promoted in 1969. But now Whitelaw is kind of laying hands and promoting some others during this period. And then it becomes clear that there's going to be talks between the IRA and the British government. One small thing I was going to tell you was that John Taylor, of course, at this stage, chaired a committee just before Stormont fell on peace lines. And he talks about the importance of using motorways, particularly the West Link, as a cordon sanitaire between disputed, conflicted parts of the city at that time. And he says that the Belfast urban motorway offers a permanent barrier to separate communities. Now, I know there's been a lot of redevelopment, but it effectively did stop people throwing stones across a 6-line highway. And Taylor, in his document, he looks at the historical background to sectarianism in Northern Ireland. Just give you a flavour of this. He's addressing the cabinet in January 1972, just before Stormont falls. Ever since the plantation, there have been two separate and distinct communities living side by side in the north of Ireland, sometimes marginally and temporally drawn together, but much more often drawn apart by contrasting and incompatible loyalties. In such circumstances, it didn't require any conscious effort, any grand segregationist plan to create divergent communities within cities, towns and villages. And so he works on this basis, but he's criticised by the UK permanent representative who's at the meeting. And he says, Anthony Hewis, he issued a minority report and said, I find myself in disagreement on the proposal that the division in the community should be accepted as a feature of life which must persist. This seems a counsel of despair. Now this is a period when you have the UDA are flexing their muscles for the first time. There are strikes by the Loyalist Association of Workers, kind of an ad hoc organisation of shipyard workers and the like. And the power is being turned off for the first time. Experiments are being made, really, for the greater strikes to come. At a meeting of the Cabinet on the 15th of June 1972, a lot of violence has been going on. The IRA didn't call a ceasefire after the fall of Stallman. William Whitelaw proposed taking this opportunity to speak to the IRA. He wrote, in many countries, including Ireland in 1921, it had proved necessary to negotiate with terrorist leaders. And suitable channels might be found, whether through the SDLP or the Roman Catholic Church. Now, this is the background to a secret meeting on the 30th of June 1972 at a big house on the Derry-Donegal border, the McCorkindale House, which straddled the border when a 22-year-old Gerry Adams and a 42-year-old Dahi O'Connell just walk across the fields from Donegal into the back of the house and meet an NIO civil servant, PJ Woodfield. And they discuss the possibility of having a ceasefire and negotiations with the British government. The official is quite impressed by Adams and O'Connell. He actually says that they asked for the release of a prominent Republican, even a couple of loyalists, and so on. The meeting lasts 2.5 hours. He says that the IRA representatives were both, or the Republican representatives were both respectable and respectful. Nobody says they're IRA representatives, he said the Republican representatives. And he says it was clear, he was clearly impressed by the two Republican representatives, informing Heath, Mr. O'Connell about 40, Mr. Adams about 23. There's no doubt that these two at least genuinely want a ceasefire and a permanent end to violence. And then he goes on to say, they made no bombastic defence of their past and to attacks on the British government, British Army or any other communities. The response to every argument put to them was reasonable and moderate. Their behaviour and attitude appeared to bear no relation to the indiscriminate campaigns of bombing and shooting in which they have both been prominent leaders. Now this is the backcloth to the high-level meeting held in Chelsea in London in the house of Paul Shannon MP, who was an NIO minister, on the 7th of July 1972. Details of which were released later that month by William Whitelaw. It was a large Republican delegation, including Chief of Staff, English-born Sean McStaphon, and of course O'Connell, Toomey, Adams, Ivor Bell, McGuinness. They were all there at that meeting. They made 3 demands of the British government. One was that the government should publicly recognise the right of the whole people of Ireland, acting as a unit, to decide the future of Ireland. That was the view of the Irish government at that time as well. Secondly, that the British government should withdraw its troops from Ireland by 1975. And thirdly, an amnesty. The talks broke down very quickly afterwards at Lenadun, at a confrontation the following Sunday. Now, the IRA campaign got underway immediately at that stage. A few days later, of course, and we have Paul Shannon and William Whitelaw there, Martin McGuinness as he was at that time. And of course, a few days later, on the 21st of July, you had the horrific atrocity of Bloody Friday, which 9 people died and 22 IRA bombs in the city. The indiscriminate car bomb used at that time. The British government, of course, changes tack completely. Its response to that, of course, is Operation Motorman on the 31st of August 1972, when troops using adapted tanks, Centurion tanks, move into the Bogside, the Cregan, Ballymurphy, and so on. Only 2 fatalities among local people. The IRA had melted away, wouldn't return for a few weeks. But of course, on the same day, you had the horrific bombing of Claudi, which of course is summed up by the poet James Symonds. You know that famous one. The Sperrin surrounded, the fawn flows by. At each end of Main Street, the hills and the sky, the small town of Claudi at ease in the sun. Last July in the morning, a new day begun. And then he describes what the various people are doing, in particular the little girl who is actually Catherine Aiken, who's cleaning the window of her parents' shot. And then he ends up by saying, you know, an explosion too loud for your eardrums to bear, young children squealing like pigs in the square, all faces chalk white or streaked with bright red, and the glass and the dust and the terrible dead. For an old lady's legs are blown off, and the head of a man's hanging open, and still he's not dead. He's shrieking for mercy, while his son stands and stares, and then suddenly quick disappears. And Christ, little Catherine Aiken is dead. Mrs. McLaughlin is pierced through the head. Meanwhile, to Dungiven, the killers have gone, and they're finding it hard to get through on the phone. 2 terrible years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Éamon. Chaos, always. Thanks very much, Éamon, and thanks for you all coming along. I hope you enjoyed that, and if you did, on all of your seats you should have got a programme of events, so there's plenty more for you to get your teeth into. We have our next event is next Monday on the Triple 20, so the first half of Éamon's talk we'll get a wee bit more into that. All booking is online, so please do go on there and find out more about our events, and thanks again everyone for coming.